This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, recorded at 14 hours GMT on Saturday, the 6th of September. I'm Oliver Conway with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, Sierra Leone plans a 3-day lockdown to try to combat the spread of Ebola. We go to Freetown. Also,
the militants have 28 times fired and shelled the anti-terrorist operation units, 10 of them after the ceasefire was proclaimed.
A ceasefire in eastern Ukraine appears to be holding, despite claims of violations from both Ukrainian government forces and pro-Russia rebels. We'll hear from our correspondent in Donetsk. How should European governments deal with jihadists who go to Iraq and Syria? We have a report from Belgium.
The people that have left from Antwerp have been stricken from the city records, which suspends their citizenship, which means that they cannot come back without being noticed.
And later,
they rise and fall with the loudspeakers, with some of the musical elements that we have coming out of them.
We'll hear from the former Velvet Underground star John Cale on the use of flying drones in his latest work. But first, the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa has killed more than 2,100 people, about a quarter of them in Sierra Leone. The government is struggling to cope. This is the view of South African health expert Janusz Paweska, working in Freetown.
Unfortunately, there is no evidences yet that we control the outbreak. I think it's becoming even worse.
Now, the government in Sierra Leone has decided to order a lockdown of at least 3 days to try to stop the virus spreading. But the move to keep people in their homes won't begin until September the 19th. But why not start it immediately? I spoke to Umaro Fofana on the line from Freetown.
You have to bear in mind that in Sierra Leone, most people live on what they make every day. So it's like time to give to the people to stock up before the lockdown. It's going to be a very severe measure, even by the admission of the government itself. I spoke with the presidential advisor, Ibrahim Ben Kagbo, who is on the task force committee. And he says, indeed, it's an aggressive move by the government. So it's going to be really tough. And the government argues that it needs to give time to people to stock up before those 4 days.
And what exactly will people have to do during that period? And where does this lockdown cover?
The lockdown covers the entire country, and it literally means that everybody must stay indoors. Call it a curfew if you would. It will be a curfew for 4 days. No one should go out of their homes. They must all stay indoors. And this presidential advisor says it's a way of trying to identify at a very early stage all those patients that may show signs and symptoms of Ebola. Because he says so far a lot of the patients that have been showing up at hospital or treatment centers are people who have waited until the very last minute. So he says it's a way to identify them. And the new figures, it has to be said, of the new cases in the last week or so have been in different areas outside of the so-called traditional epicenter areas in the east. The northern flank of the country has had heavy numbers in the last few days and week, as well as in the capital, Freetown. This has been attributed to the fact that there is so much movement of people from all parts of the country to all other parts of the country. So it is like everybody stay indoors, so we are able to track people who have the virus in the places where they have them, so we don't have new cases. That, the government says, is the logic behind this.
I mean, it sounds like quite an amazing thing to keep the whole country indoors for 4 days. Will it be possible?
Well, we wait to see how that pans out. The last time the government tried it was for 1 day, and that worked very effectively. Nobody moved out of their homes. I drove along the streets of Freetown as a journalist. They allowed me to, and the streets were completely deserted. Everybody stayed indoors. 4 days, we wait to see how that will be policed.
Briefly, will there be any exemptions?
There will be the obvious exemptions. Medical workers will be allowed to move up and down. Journalists would, I would imagine, be allowed to move up and about. Security forces will be allowed to move. And the presidential advisor, Ibrahim Ben Kagbo, says 21,000 people will be recruited to effect this. So I'd imagine those 21,000 people will be out and about. Or whether the government will decide to make it a neighborhood kind of thing. Let's recruit some guys in this area so they'll be able to police their own area. I'm not sure about the details. But the exemptions will be medical workers, aid workers, and probably some journalists as well.
Ob Sisse is an economic and political risk analyst originally from Sierra Leone and has just returned from there. He spoke to Lise Doucet.
What happens when you find somebody with malaria or with measles or with other diseases that present similar symptoms. Because you don't have rapid diagnostic kits, you're not going to be able to there and then diagnose them, eliminate them as a risk, or take them away for isolation. And if you do find people who do have Ebola, what are you going to do with them now? At the moment, we've got less than 150 beds for treating people with Ebola across the country. Yet we're having something like 20 to 30 cases a day. And also, when you consider that nearly 25% of new cases and deaths have happened in the last 21 days, and add that to the fact that there's significant levels of underreporting, you can see that the problem is extremely exponential. Secondly, the government's plan is to come in from the 18th of September. That is nearly 2 to 3 weeks away. In the meantime, the disease is rapidly spreading. What we have to admit now is that the national authorities do not have the infrastructure or the resources to deal with this. The few NGOs that are there and WHO themselves are calling for massive, rapid international intervention. And that is what we need immediately right now.
What form would that take, Obi?
Normally, if the best example to use is the Philippines typhoon, I think it was called Haiyan a couple of years ago. The immediate emergency international response to that involved foreign military teams that were underground setting up field hospitals and dealing it as a humanitarian disaster. I think because two reasons. One, because the scale of the crisis in West Africa has been creeping up. It's cumulative as it goes on. It's not as massive as a typhoon. And secondly, the world is very much focused at the moment on what's going on in Iraq with IS and what's going on in Ukraine with the separatists there. And so attention doesn't seem to be paid to this. But this is a very, very serious problem. We've seen it spread to 5 countries when initially it was just one village in Guinea. It's gone to Nigeria, and everyone thought it was isolated at the airport with just one guy on a flight from Liberia. But now we hear of it being in Port Harcourt, the capital of Nigeria's oil and gas industry. This thing is running away, and unless there is a rapid international military and civilian medical response to contain this, I fear we'll be looking at a massive disaster. We'll look back on this and wish we did something.
Do you think the authorities in Sierra Leone and indeed in its neighbours are aware that they do need a much bigger, and a global response to this?
Yes, they do, and they've been calling for it for quite a while. It's quite unfortunate, and it's one of the most insidious things about Ebola. The problem you have, and the reason why an international intervention is so urgently required, is first of all, the health systems in these countries have completely collapsed. I'm telling you about pregnant women dying because nobody will take the risk of delivering their babies. I'm talking about children with very serious conditions being removed from hospital because one boy there has been diagnosed with Ebola. I'm talking about people with malaria and measles and all other readily treatable diseases are now dying because they can't go to hospital. It's running out of control. Secondly, nobody knows how Ebola behaves in dense, large, dense populations. All previous outbreaks have been confined to rural or isolated areas. So nobody quite knows what happens when Ebola has such a free reign in the human population. What are the risks that the virus would mutate? Secondly, there are now worrying reports from Liberia that it's being introduced into the marine ecosystem. We've had cases of bodies being thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. I haven't confirmed that myself, but it's something we've heard. And the risk is certainly there. What happens if marine life feeds on these corpses? We just don't know. We are in uncharted territory. And every day we leave it, the problem becomes more exponential. We need rapid intervention now.
Ob Sisse talking to NewsHour. After months of violence in eastern Ukraine, a ceasefire struck on Friday appears to be largely holding. There have been no confirmed reports of fighting overnight. The 2 cities which suffered the worst clashes immediately before the truce, Donetsk and Mariupol, have remained quiet since it came into effect. These residents of Donetsk, though, were sceptical about the ceasefire.
Trust or don't trust, it doesn't matter. I hope for the best. Whether we want it or not, it's not up to us, the people. No one wants war. I want peace, and that's it. For them not to shoot, not to kill children.
I
don't think it'll last, because Comrade Poroshenko doesn't keep his word. And that's not just me, it's what most people in Donetsk think.
What ceasefire? It's just a theatre performance. I know this for sure. I can tell you as a political scientist that this war will last for 5 to 9 years. To kill so many men, Slavic men, Slavic people killing Slavic people. What can be worse? I think in the whole world there are no people closer than Russians and Ukrainians. In fact, it's really one people.
Lise Doucette spoke to our correspondent in Donetsk, Richard Galpin.
We've been out on the streets, Lise, and it does seem pretty calm, I have to say, and people are milling about. And this is obviously a massive change from what it was 24 hours or so ago when there were heavy barrages of artillery fire. We have also been up to the airport, which was the focus of the fighting. Ukrainian troops holed up inside the airport building there, fighting off assaults from the rebels. When we were there, we did hear a couple of smallish explosions and a few gunshots, but we spoke to a local person and he was saying that essentially it had been quiet since the ceasefire came into force. Having said all of that, both sides are accusing each other of violations, but they don't seem to be major violations, and I don't think, it's fatal for the ceasefire.
And on the ground, do both sides want this to work? Obviously their leaders came together under great pressure and in the wake of a NATO summit, but are they still raring for a fight?
I think, it depends on the conditions and what the final outcome is going to be. And the two sides are absolutely miles apart on that. We've already heard it very, very clearly. Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, said that this was a deal of which the political side would mean that they would grant greater autonomy, greater powers to this region and allow them to use the Russian language or whatever language they want to use. But the rebels are saying very clearly that their goal, as it's been for some time, is to create an independent state. And according to one rebel leader we spoke to, that independent state would be extended across the whole of eastern Ukraine and west as far as the border with Moldova and Romania to create what they call Novorossiya, New Russia. So they're diametrically opposed. And my sense was that certainly, obviously, either side, if they can achieve their goals now through peaceful means, then of course they would prefer it. But if not, then there will be fighting again.
Well, we saw reports yesterday that despite the announcement of a ceasefire, that people were still leaving the region. Is that still happening today?
I haven't seen that myself, but I think you can understand it given the scale of the fighting which has been going on over the past 5 months in a region where people really, not in their worst nightmares, could have ever imagined that it would descend into effectively civil war here and what looks like Russian intervention from across the border. And I think there have been quite a few ceasefires before which have been broken. So people are not trusting in this ceasefire and perhaps see this as an opportunity to get out safely whilst they can.
Richard Galpin in Donetsk. The new military authorities in Egypt have long disliked Qatar because of its support for the Muslim Brotherhood, which the army removed from power last year. Now, Qatar has been formally named in a crime case, with the ousted Egyptian president, Mohamed Morsi, being accused of passing national security documents to it. As our Arab Affairs editor Sebastian Usher told me earlier, Mr Morsi is already in jail and could face the death penalty.
He's still facing a variety of trials and charges. This latest one is something that's been in the air for some time, and now there's actually been the Prosecutor General in Egypt has presented a 3-page charge sheet which is accusing him of passing state secrets to Qatar. Now, it's indirectly in a sense because it's aides close to him, his secretary, the director of his office when he was president, are accused for a sum of money, a very round sum of money, $1 million, are accused of passing the positions of Egyptian forces, their kind of military strength and things about the strategy and the policy of the country to Qatar, both in its state capacity to the security services there, but also to the news network that it runs, Al Jazeera.
Is this then a message to Qatar?
Well, it's a continuing message, as you were saying, and the Qataris are deeply unpopular with the government which took over from Mohamed Morsi, because essentially Qatar was very much behind a project, not just in Egypt, but across the Middle East, across the Arab world after the Arab Spring, where the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't just in Egypt, it was in other countries, Libya and Tunisia, and it was seen as the likeliest political entity that would take over from the toppled dictators, and Qatar was very much behind that. It was giving billions of dollars to Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood to keep the Egyptian economy afloat then. So it was a huge setback to Qatar when he was deposed. And there's been no let-up in the pressure since then. And talking about Al Jazeera, I mean, we know that 3 journalists from Al Jazeera at the moment, it's a sentence of 10 years, but they're serving on charges that Al Jazeera certainly says are entirely trumped up.
Sebastian Usher. This is Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. To comment on this podcast or the topics in it, send an email to globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk or post at facebook.com/BBC World Service. What should the West do about jihadis that leave for Iraq or Syria and then come back? It's a question that's been worrying politicians here in Britain recently. And in Belgium, which has more nationals per head going off to fight than any of its European neighbours, it is a significant issue. Now, some Belgian politicians want to see a ban on jihadis coming back, as Chris Vallance reports from Antwerp.
On Wednesday, the residents of the Flemish town of Antwerp awoke to news of the killing of journalist Steven Sotloff. Although it's men with British accents who have a grim hold on the headlines, for its size, Belgium sends proportionately more foreign fighters than any other Western European nation. And from his office in the Renaissance splendour of Antwerp City Hall, Mayor and leader of Belgium's largest political party, Bart de Wever, is determined to make sure those fighters don't return.
We've had 70 people from the city of Antwerp that have went to the Middle East, and of 60 of them we're pretty sure that they are involved in extremist groups. And I think we should prevent people coming back. The people that have left from Antwerp have been stricken from the city records, which suspends their citizenship, which means that they cannot come back without being noticed. But I'm all for taking away their citizenship permanently so they cannot enter Europe anymore.
Bart de Wever wishes to close the door to returning jihadists. But in a cafe outside a Brussels station, one Belgian mother, who didn't wish to be named, is desperate to keep it open.
And sometimes we heard that perhaps he wanted to come back, but 4 hours later, another phone call, and he said, no, I will not come back, I will stay here and I will never come back.
She says her 18-year-old son went to Syria in the company of 2 unrelated individuals.
They go together, the 3, at the same time in the same plane. But there was a young who was 13 years old. 13.
She's part of a support group made up of parents whose children have gone to Syria, and she would very much like her son back. You don't think he'd be dangerous if he came?
No, because when I have a phone call with him, he's already with some joke. He's not a terrorist, he's not a dangerous man. It's a young boy with a bad experience.
And also at the cafe, another member of the group, a woman, likewise with a son in Syria. She also wanted him to be able to return.
We should change the discourse and say you can come back, but under strict conditions. There are youngsters who followed the wrong path. They went to Syria and it wasn't what they expected, so they want to return.
Across town in the Court of Appeals in Antwerp, I meet the lawyer Chris Lux. He tells me he has a number of clients who've returned from Syria. One, Jehan Bontink, became disillusioned and Chris says made attempts to return home. He ended up being held captive by ISIS for a period. During that time he got to know murdered journalist James Foley, and when he finally made it out of Syria, shared what he knew with the authorities.
That information was transferred worldwide because he was the first one who gave real correct advice and information about the whereabouts of a lot of people over there, and not only victims but also people who were together with him over there in Syria. And he was questioned lots of times by different intelligence officers.
Chris Lux wonders if closing the door to returning jihadists could be closing the door to useful information.
Yeah, not everyone who is coming back wants to sit together and work with the police. I understand that. But those who saw what happens over there and who have second doubts, I hope that if they come back, that they are allowed to come back, and that if they have the possibility to speak, that they do it, because that's the best way to prohibit other young guys and also women to go over there.
That report from Antwerp by Chris Valence. North Korea has launched 3 short-range missiles into the waters off its east coast ahead of a major holiday celebrated by both Koreas. The South Korean military said they landed in the East Sea. Our correspondent Stephen Evans is in Seoul.
3 short-range missiles fired out in the direction of Japan, but nowhere near reaching Japan, about 130 miles out into the sea. Whether it's to do with the holiday, whether it's to do with sending another message, we simply don't know. There are actually a lot of these tests, something like 19 rounds of tests this year. So it doesn't change the fundamental situation. It is not an escalation of the situation. These, remember, are short-range missiles. North Korea has short-range missiles, which have a range of about 100 miles. These are estimated to have a range of 130 miles. So it's simply a case of expanding the arsenal, improving the arsenal. Now, that doesn't diminish the threat or whatever, but it's not a sea change in the politics of the situation.
But it is a development in that they can reach slightly further than they could before.
That's right. And that matters because the US in South Korea is slowly moving its troops southwards. So as US troops, as US bases move southwards on the peninsula, then North Korea tries to increase the range of its missiles in that kind of short-term potential conflict. This should be distinguished from the seeking after missiles which can deliver nuclear warheads, were they to be developed, which would then clearly change the game if that was possible.
Stephen Evans talking to me from Seoul. It's almost 50 years since John Cale founded the Velvet Underground with Lou Reed. Even though he's now in his 70s, he's still coming up with new works, still doing things that no one has done before. The latest takes place in London next weekend. While John Cale and his band play on stage, a small squadron of drones will fly above the audience. Some of these drones or mini helicopters will carry loudspeakers, some microphones, others lights, and some will even be in so-called costumes. As John Cale describes it himself, it's more like an installation than a rock and roll concert. Sarah Montague sat with him in the Barbican's conservatory and he told her how it should work.
Each individual item in the visual has a character, or will have a character. When you put one of them up, it's a mystery. When you put 2 of them up, there's a dialogue going on.
What? Hold on a second. You've got drones flying over the heads of the audience. You say a dialogue. What do you mean? What are on these drones?
Well, some of the drones, we tested them because we wanted to use the noise of the drones. So we wanted to put pickups on these drones and distribute the sound. So that's one of the elements. The other one is that we have loudspeakers put on them, and they rise and fall with the loudspeakers, with some of the musical elements that we have coming out of them. And they vary from song to song. What happens is you're pulled into, identifying the drones. It's like having a pet. You imbue the pet with human qualities. And so you watch these drones, and inevitably you will start, seeing some kind of character in them. It's just
and so
nature.
Part of the experience, because what you start thinking is this is just about immersing the audience in a sound in a different way.
Very much.
But you're saying there's an extra element, which is that they feel, warmly towards the drones? They think of them as...
That's inevitable. I think that's inevitable. I mean, that's the way people operate. I mean, it'll be disturbing in some extent. I mean, it's like asking somebody whose pet cat is called Roger to change the name of the cat and call him Bunny from now on. I mean, have you got a pet cat?
No, but I'm just wondering why that should be the case with a speaker on a drone flying above your head in an audience. Is it because you're changing the sound coming out of it?
Yeah, and because you've got swarm going on. You're swarming the audience with information.
It's unusual. It's new. This sort of thing has never been done, as I understand it.
No, unfortunately. I wish I'd learned from it.
But except you probably wouldn't be interested if somebody else had done it. I mean, that's something of a hallmark of your... You're nodding there because it's a hallmark of your work, that all the stuff that you've done over decades has been, I don't want to do the old stuff, I want to do something new.
Yeah, that's more important. I mean, I don't like looking at history.
No, I know you don't like looking at history, but we are going to turn to history because, of course, for many people, with all your recent work, one of the first associations, you say, John Cale, it's with Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. I read something that you had said after he died a year ago, which was you were angry and you were frustrated and it sounded like you were angry with him because he died of liver disease, because he'd wasted his life on wine rather than work.
Well, I mean, those are nostalgic moments when you remember exactly what the purpose was of working together in the first place. The purpose was that work was the most important thing, and you just worked and worked. And that's something that Andy sort of, pulled together. Yeah, I mean, work was more fun than fun. So you get down to it and you just never stop. And I just got the impression that maybe he just wasn't interested anymore. I wasn't in touch with him then. It's a sad time. I mean,
you say you weren't in touch with him, but you did reconnect with him at numerous points, and it was a friendship, wasn't it?
Yes.
But it was obviously a very turbulent one.
Well, it would be, yeah. I mean, once we got down to work, there was no problem. And that's kind of the focus that I have on it, is if we'd done more work, we'd have been better off.
You talk about how much work you did, and yet for many people they think back to the factory, to what Velvet Underground seemed to be about at that time.
Man, when I put a spike into my vein, and I tell you things aren't quite the same when I'm rushing on my run.
It was decadent. It was drug taking. I don't think many people think that it was work.
There was a hell of a lot of work going on. It wasn't fun and games. I mean, it was hilarious, but it wasn't all fun and games.
John Cale talking to Sarah Montague. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available to download on Sunday. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.